And once we accumulate 8 other students, that would be a time to maybe check out. But you can continue to watch us live,
Okay.
and you may rejoin us in a little bit if there should be another vacancy.
Okay.
We're live.
Okay, Ahmed, are you there?
Ahmed, you mean? Professor White?
Yes. Welcome.
Yes, I'm there. Thank you very much, Professor. It's a pleasure to join you in this hangout. I'm very glad to take this course with you. I'm very glad to learn from you. I have a question that I have published in the forum, which is about how it all starts and the concept of the soul. So I watched the neural signaling in week 3 and week 4. We talked about the molecular mechanisms, the ionic mechanisms, but what does initiate these factors? What are the triggering factors? What differentiate between a dead brain and a live brain, if I may ask? Thank you very much, Professor.
Certainly. Well, thank you for a very thoughtful and a very deep question. When we're studying neural signaling, what actually causes the initial action is typically the signals from other neurons that are impinging upon a neuron under study or under investigation. So it's easy to forget when we're studying those basic mechanisms, and it's easy for me to forget as an instructor that every neuron is connected to hundreds, thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of other neurons. And those neurons are all active at some level. So there are always signals impinging upon any given brain cell that we may want to focus our attention on. Now, if you're asking how did this get started from a developmental standpoint, that's coming later in the course. We do have a unit of the course around weeks 9 and 10 and 11 that deal with the developing brain. And at some point, the developing neurons acquire the capacity to generate electrical signals. So that happens in the 2nd trimester of pregnancy and into the 3rd trimester. Until that time, brain cells are like all other cells in the body. They're active, they're viable, they're creating chemicals, they're processing signals that are mediated via cell-cell interactions and secreted molecules, but they're not yet generating action potentials. That happens relatively late after the neurons are born and after they migrate and establish their correct locations within gray matter of the central nervous system. But at some point, they do start becoming intrinsically active. And at that point, that's really where these activity-dependent mechanisms begin to engage. Now, if we're talking about sensory systems, at some point, those systems begin to be modulated by the energy of the environment around us, the sound waves that hit our auditory system, photons of light that strike the retina, and so forth. And for the motor system, that intrinsic activity begins to engage our skeletal muscles and we begin to move, which in turn drives sensory experience. So there is a bit of a cycle by which the activity the brain creates engages the environment, and that engagement feeds into the brain, of course, and modulates the function of the brain. But we shouldn't think about brain activity as being passively related to environmental interaction. The brain is always generating its own activity that is modulated by our interactions with the world around us. So you also had a question about the soul, which is also interesting. Do you want to say a little bit more about what that question is? So you also had a question about this.
The question is not that one for me, but I think from maybe from a religious or scientific point of view, what differentiate between dead or a complete nervous system? For example, a person who died due to a cardiac reason, for any reason, but the brain is still intact. You cannot reactivate that nervous system, of course, because it's dead. But what is the difference? What's the main difference between that live and that dead nervous system?
That's a great
This will be
question.
my last question.
I'm curious to know your own thoughts on that matter. What would you say?
Well, for being a Muslim, I believe in soul and I believe in Allah, but I want the scientific point of view so I can match my opinion with it.
Sure. Um, I'm reaching to grab my brain as a tool for this discussion. So you're probably familiar with the concept of brain death.
Yes,
That
unmilitary state.
refers to a state where the cerebral cortex is sufficiently dysfunctional or injured such that it is no longer capable of supporting the faculties that we associate with cognition. However, there's the brain stem. And in brain death, we imagine that there is sufficient activity in the brain stem to support the body's physiological rhythms, such as respiration, cardiac rhythm, and so on. So one might say that brain death is not necessarily the death of the individual, but rather the destruction of the faculties of the brain that support cognition. But it does raise the question about at what point do we consider a being to be dead? And one might come to different conclusions about that. One might insist that all cellular activity throughout the brain must cease in order for death to be pronounced. One might insist that all cellular activity throughout the entire body, not just the brain. And different societies over the years, and even today, different societies around the world have different notions of this. For example, in certain European nations, there is a growing culture around the idea of older adults seeking to end their lives through the donation of organs. And that can be considered to be completely acceptable in some societies or morally objectionable in others. It does hinge upon perhaps one's view of the meaning of death. From my standpoint, I think biologically, we think of consciousness as a more distributed faculty these days than we once did. While the notion of brain death associated with damage to the cerebral cortex is still entrenched clinically, I think neurobiologically, we have a more broader distributed sense of cognition. And these days, there's even a sense of grounded cognition. Implying that not only do we need a brain to be cognitively enabled, but that brain must be embodied. And so with all of those thoughts in mind, I would say that death is more of a gradual process than we often consider it. I happen to be married to a physician who takes care of people at the end of their lives, and she is very, very familiar with death in the way that most people in healthcare are not. And in her experience, death is very much a process that unfolds sometimes over minutes, more often over hours, and sometimes over days, weeks, and even months. So it's a very deep question that you're asking, and I haven't really said anything that addresses the relationship between our notions of the human soul and this biological organ. That's a whole other subject, which perhaps we can get into at some point. But I think that my own personal views are that there are many traditions of faith that we have yet to reconcile with our modern understanding of this organ. And my own position is to be somewhat agnostic about how to consider the reconciliation of these traditions. I am impressed, however, I would say, with how many of my colleagues in the field of neuroscience are open to this question. there was a time in my field where people were very dogmatic about opposing any faith-based notion of the meaning of humanity in terms of our soulishness. But now I think neuroscience has moved a little closer to many traditions in the humanities and outside of academia with this respect. So I think if we approach these questions with open minds, we might be surprised at the mutual insight we can gain from each other.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome. And one last question. Where are you?
I am in Saudi Arabia. I'm a Sudanese medical student.
Okay. Well, it's a delight to
be in vacation in Saudi Arabia.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Ahmed. I appreciate it very much. Let's go to Deborah. Deborah, are you there?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. Professor White, I can't say enough about the course. This is my second time around. I really enjoyed the course January through March, and at least one of my colleagues is taking it now in this session. My question is a little bit of a chicken and the egg question. Okay. I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm thinking about action potentials and neuroplasticity regarding emotions and behavior, and how is it when we're looking at all our various voltage-gated channels and our all the different receptors and neurotransmitters that an actual emotion and expression of behavior occurs. And then I do have a part two, so I don't know if you want to hear it now or wait.
Why don't you give me part two?
Okay.
That will buy me a little time to think about part one.
Good. Okay. So part two is in therapy, when we do see that we feel that it's working well. There are times that it isn't. When we feel things are working well, again, what exactly is happening regarding action potentials, long-term depression or potentiation, and neuroplasticity? It's kind of like, what is the code breaking of why therapy would work really at a neurobiological and I guess actually now molecular sort of level?
Yeah. Well, Deborah, thank you for the questions. They are very important questions, and I'm sure I won't have satisfactory answers to them, but I'm rather confident that no one really has satisfactory answers to them just yet. I think what we can be certain of is that there is activity involving electrical signals, action potentials, there's synaptic integration, and there is plasticity within those synaptic connections, and this is happening all of the time. My sense is that when you as a clinician have a sense that therapy is beginning to turn a corner on someone's affect or their mood or their behavior, very likely there is some kind of adaptive plasticity that's playing out within neural circuits that are mediating that emotion or that motivated behavior, that sense of self, that sense of well-being. And there are probably complementary changes that are happening in systems that are somewhat dynamically opposed to one another. For example, we know that there are parts of the brain, including the amygdala and its extended network in the ventral regions of the medial forebrain, that are particularly engaged when we have a sense of threat, and that network is involved in mediating much motivated behavior that is of a defensive nature and potentially an aggressive nature. So if a person is having anxiety issues, part of that plasticity that you might hope to achieve involves perhaps a decrease in the output of that network, a decrease in the activation of the amygdala, but also probably an increase in the activation of other parts of the brain, including parts along the midline that we call the default mode network. And those more medial parts of the brain are consistent with introspection, with reflection, with a positive sense of well-being. So there's probably both a resetting of activity that's happening, and that potentially could be measured with a tool such as functional magnetic resonance imaging. But in order to achieve that impact...
Can I just ask about that, what you just mentioned just now? because that is part of my question as well. The sensor that reads images like of the brain,
Yes.
like
If you don't mind, Deborah, we can allow Puneet to jump in here for just a second. Okay, go
Absolutely.
ahead.
so basically like if you can image the brain and you can map it out, can't you do things to like basically beam like some sort of like uh frequency to like control it electromagnetically, like through imaging like machines?
Well, not through imaging. Imaging is a passive mechanism that is responding to intrinsic changes in the brain. One can imagine manipulating brain activity through things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or more invasively with something like deep brain stimulation. So there are ways to gain access to particular circuits to modulate their activity. The kind of imaging that I was just alluding to in response to Deborah's question is simply passively monitoring the ongoing activity of the brain, or the activity of the brain that's evoked by a particular kind of stimulus. So in the work that's going on in psychiatry these days, we see both happening. We see methods that are describing brain state with increasing precision that will help us understand more about what brain states are associated with what kinds of states of wellness or illness. But we are also seeing the introduction of technologies that allow clinicians to actually modulate and maybe even alter brain states, sometimes with really remarkable therapeutic benefits. For example, getting back to some of Deborah's domains, there are studies going on at places like Duke where transcranial magnetic stimulation is being used to treat major depressive syndromes, like bipolar disorder 1, for example. And there are some patients who aren't helped by any of the traditional methods and seem to respond to these technologies. So that may be one way to, with rather brute force methods, try to change brain activity. As a brain scientist, I actually am quite uncomfortable with those methods. I'd much rather have cognitive behavioral therapy be the medium by which we change the function of circuits in the brain, or the experience of one's own body through physical activity. So I think we've yet to really exhaust the potential of simply using the brain and the body that we have for therapeutic benefit. And maybe we're a little too quick to embrace technologies that are changing the brain in ways that we don't yet fully understand. So sorry for the long-winded answer, Deborah. Let me go back to you and see if you have any follow-on comments or questions.
Okay.
Yes, this has made me think. I recently was able to do a tour of Daniel Amen's clinic in New York City, near where I live, and the kind of SPECT scans they do, and they have some brand new equipment from Germany. I'm going to be able to shadow a doctor one day, so I'm so excited. All the various ways that they're working with, if anyone's seen that movie Concussion about the, I can't think of the term, the name that it is right now, but the repeated hits to the head that...
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy?
Thank you. Yes. So they've been working with NFL players and looking at what can be done with that traumatic brain injury. But getting back to the therapy aspect, when you mentioned the cognitive behavioral, I do something called brain spotting therapy. And this is a therapy that grew out of the EMDR, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, the FAST movement. Mm-hmm. What we found is with a one fixed gaze point that has to do with the sort of traumatic or difficult area in a person's life. When they get that gaze point, this is moving into our visual area, that time on that point seems to make all that amygdala stirred up activity calm down amazingly, and people seem to have amazing results that we watch for months get better. So I'm really interested in knowing from your perspective. We're trying to get more, evidence-based research, and I'm going to be working on a PhD soon to see how I might be able to go into what goes on with the visual. We're very interested in the subcortical and how the cortical, to us anyway, rests upon the subcortical, that it's so guided by what is fired in that emotion and experience in our history. So.
Well, that's really fascinating. I think one tool that you might want to explore as you're visiting the lab and getting more into the literature is a method of doing functional magnetic resonance imaging that is called functional connectivity. So essentially what this is a statistical means for analyzing activity within the brain, and it's based on the presumption that parts of the brain that are coactive are somehow strengthening their connections one to the other, or maybe they're connected to a third party and there are strengthening connections there. So in cognitive neuroscience, this approach is being used for all kinds of studies, including the kinds of studies that you're describing. So one might ask, how is that fixation protocol that you described changing functional connectivity in the brain? Maybe, for example, it is weakening connections between the amygdala and some behavioral affective areas. Or maybe it's strengthening connections between parts of that default mode network that we associate with more of a relaxed state of introspection that might be more healthy for a person dealing with a particular disturbance of some sort. So I think there are various methods that are being brought to bear that allow us to describe both brain structure and function with ever increasingly precise terms. And as we do that, maybe we will get much better at knowing where can we target interventions, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation or deep brain stimulation in those cases that warrant that degree of modulation or invasiveness. But I love the idea of saying, what can we do with mind and body to try to reshape the structure and function of circuits in the brain? I think that's tremendous work. So I certainly will applaud the professional journey you're on, Deborah, and wish you all the success as you go forward.
Oh, thank you so much. Really appreciate all your comments and your expertise.
You're welcome. At this point, I would like for you all to recognize Ellen Vos-Visa, who has been for many years now our chief mentor in medical neuroscience, and she's probably known to many of you through her comments on the post, and I hope known to all of you through the work she's put in over the last year or so creating the Learn Medical Neuroscience website. So, Ellen, do you want to just say a few things?
Yes, first thing, I want to congratulate you with the course ending up in the top 50 of all MOOCs all around. I mean, that's a wonderful achievement, and I'm very proud. I feel part of it, and I'm very proud to be part of it.
Well, thank you, Ellen. As you and I know, and everyone else should know, you've been with medical neuroscience from its very first beginning, and we certainly wouldn't have achieved that degree of recognition without your input. So, and I know even more important than that is the learning that you've supported for what I would love to think is now tens of thousands of people from all over the world.
Yes, it's for me, it's also so stimulating to get all the response on the forum and have people finding other resources all the time. I think it's a wonderful time. Every time I join, it's wonderful. And it's the same feeling in the on-demand courses as it was on the session-based courses. So I'm very happy with that.
So Ellen, do you have any tips for our present students?
Well, my major tip is enjoy it as much as you can.
Well, thank you. That's a very wise bit of advice for everyone to take to heart. So
I think that pleasure is very important in learning, because if you like to do it, then it's so much easier to remember and to build on your knowledge if you're really interested. So that positive feeling of fun is very important.
Yes, and for those of you who may be interested in more specific tips about the course and learning about this fascinating and wonderful field of neuroscience, Ellen's website, learnmedicalneuroscience.nl, is a tremendous resource. It's linked from our medical neuroscience course, but you can just find it independently. And there are study guides, there are collections of links to resources from around the world. It's really, to my knowledge, the single best repository of information for learning about the brain sciences that anyone has put together. So it's a really unique resource. And it's specifically designed for students that are learning in medical neuroscience.
Well, thank you very much. I also like to stress that people can best look at the study strategy and all the study tips as well, and not only focus on the content parts of the course.
Absolutely, yeah. So Ellen has done it herself, and she has mentored many people along through this rather large and complex and challenging course. I appreciate the work that everybody has done here. Great. Well, Puneet looks like he has more in his mind and would like to jump back in here. So maybe I'll go back to you, Puneet, and see what you might want to say.
Yeah, thanks for that. Basically, I just want to know about like what can be done to like the brain to make it like better, or like enhance it to work as like a more like powerful machine, like powerful like tool to like be used like superior to other people, like through transcranial like methods. Transcranial, what was it?
Transcranial magnetic stimulation is the technique I refer to.
Yeah, that technique to basically enhance the brain. Like, do you think it's possible?
Well, absolutely it's possible, but I think really the best way to enhance the brain is to harness the plastic potential of synapses and circuits within the brain. And in order to do that, we don't just need technology. In fact, maybe technology isn't the best way to do it. Perhaps the best way to do it is to understand the principles of plasticity and then try to use those principles to change our brain. So, for example, one of those principles is repetition. And in order to optimally change synaptic connectivity, synaptic strength, to grow new synapses, we have to repeat the experience or the action or the sensation, whatever we're talking about. It has to be repeated in a fairly reliable way, minimizing the variance from one repetition to the next. That requires a lot of patience, and a lot of us just don't have the discipline or the patience to fully maximize that potential benefit. So this is a big problem, for example, in trying to help people that have had injuries to their bodies or their brains recover from those injuries. We are getting better at knowing what are the right kinds of therapies to devise for those people, but the challenge is really providing the structure that allows these individuals to experience the benefit. Now, if you have an intact body and an intact nervous system, you may be wondering, well, how can I just be better? How can I improve my performance? These same principles of repetition would apply as well. But again, if you have an intact body and an intact nervous system, you may be wondering, I think there's a little feedback coming in from someone, so perhaps maybe Steve, you just joined us, maybe you could mute your microphone for just a moment. Thank you. So, you know, I think that as we repeat our performance, we have to do so in a structured way that minimizes the variance, maybe isolates a few sequences or a few movements or a few experiences at a time, and then really repeat to a rather high level of of repetition than most of us are capable of doing without a considerable amount of focus and attention and discipline. I'm thinking of my own attempts to develop my musical abilities, and I know that I don't practice nearly enough, and the way that I practice really suffers because I tend not to isolate the component movements that ought to be repeated. On my particular instrument, one of the great masters of the 20th century was Andres Segovia, and he used to tell his students, play this measure 100 times and then come back and I'll talk to you. And that's the kind of insight that modern neuroscience is beginning to describe in synaptic and circuit terms. That's the kind of focus and repetition I'm talking about. So I think we all have the potential to improve the efficiency and the output of our neural circuits. It's a matter of understanding best how to harness those principles. Okay, I think I'm going to jump over to Steve, who's recently joined us. So, Steve, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
If we have more free time, can we come back to me again? I have a couple more questions.
Sure.
But it's relating to this as well.
Okay, let's let Steve jump in, and then we'll come back.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi there. Hi. First of all, thanks, Professor White and the team for putting together such a fantastic course.
Well,
and really enjoying it so far. And I've got two questions really related to research. The first one is, what do you think are the most exciting areas of research in neuroscience at the moment? And conversely, what areas do you think maybe are not getting enough attention and maybe need more attention and research?
Well, I'll start with your second question. I think it is just what we were talking about. I think we need to better understand the means by which circuits in the brain can be adapted and reshaped by the experiences of our mind and our body. I think that's not getting enough attention. What is getting a lot of attention, and I'm grateful for it, is how technologies can be developed to alter the structure and function of brain circuits. We absolutely need those technologies if we're going to make progress in treating so many very challenging conditions that afflict individuals all over the world. But we shouldn't just depend on the technology. I think we need to understand the biology of neuroplasticity much better than we do, and understand how it has evolved to reshape the structure and function of the brain through the ordinary experiences of our lives. And I think that could really be transformative if we know how to do that well. So that's the piece that I would say is underfunded and maybe somewhat underrepresented in current neuroscience research. To get to your first question, some of the things I'm very excited about does in fact go back to technology. For example, we have a terrific research program based here in Duke and in various centers around the world that is using technology called the brain-machine interface, where neural signals are being recorded either from the scalp using electroencephalographic techniques or from the brain directly using invasive microelectrodes. And then those signals are being decoded by artificial neural networks for the purpose of driving various kinds of output devices, everything from computers to exoskeletons that will enable people with spinal cord injuries to walk. So I think there's really very exciting work that's going to, I think, really transform the interface of technology and brain science. So that would be one area that I'm excited about. I'm also excited about work in a very different domain of neuroscience, and that pertains to a deeper understanding of how the brain science relates to various kinds of human endeavors that we might associate with, let's say, the humanities, like art, be it visual art or music or some other kind of performative movement. I'm also interested in literature and the notions of semantic representation in the brain. And this relates to a topic we talked earlier about in the Hangout called grounded cognition, which is understanding the mind in terms of the grounding of the brain within the sensory and motor faculties of the body. So I think there is some very interesting new science. In fact, just a few weeks ago on the cover of Nature, there was a beautiful study from Jacques Gallant's lab out in California demonstrating really for the first time a rather comprehensive semantic map of the cerebral cortex. And some of the insights there I think are really beautiful. For example, when we consider a semantic concept such as top, the word T-O-P, we engage parts of our brain that have to do with space, spatial relations of different parts. We also engage parts of our brain that have to do with numerosity, like numerical orders and sequencing of things. We also engage parts of the brain that are involved in social constructs, such as understanding the dynamics of hierarchy within social networks. So I think there's really a new opening for brain science to impact and engage more broadly a community of scholars and disciplines that are represented in the humanities. So I think that's something that I have a personal interest in. I think it's going to be very exciting to see how these broader discoveries in neuroscience intersect and with greater relevance to the rest of society. I could go on and on all day, but I'm going to stop there. Do you have any personal thoughts on this question, Steve?
Yeah, I think just following on from what you're talking about there and the previous questions about that idea of deliberate practice, kind of Eric Anderson's idea of peak performance and deliberate practice and how you can get the most out of practicing, whether it's playing guitar, but also dealing with people like stroke patients, how you can really make their therapy and their physical therapy and make it really the best you can to get that plasticity in their brain. So I think they're for sure interesting areas. And as you say, that crossover into literature and art, and where does creativity come from? At what point does the brain create something new and that's artistic? I think these are those questions.
So where are you, Steve?
I'm in a place called Tunbridge Wells in England, so just south of London.
And what brings you to medical neuroscience?
Yeah, just a general interest in dealing with like mindfulness and that kind of area of research in medical neuroscience. Also, dealing with back pain patients and things like that, and like the kind of pain things we've talked about and how that works for people, and just that general idea of plasticity and interest in all those areas of the brain and neuroscience.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you for your interest and your participation in the course.
Thank you. Thanks for the course.
All right, let's go to Baba Whale. I apologize if I'm not saying your name correctly.
All right, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, my name is Baba Wale. I'm from Nigeria. And I would like to say hello to everyone and thank you so much for this course, Professor. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot. So I was intrigued by one of the discussion topics. That's the one talking about the brain is bigger, better. So as a resident in neurology, I'm currently in my second year. We see a lot of patients on the clinical setting. And we kind of work based on what we're able to notice from these patients. And talking specifically about dementias now. When we get imaging, one of the features we see is cerebral atrophy. And looking at it that way, you'd think, okay, smaller brain is worse off. But this atrophy, at times, we see that's the end of the spectrum, in that we might see someone with early features of dementia, and by the time you get the brain scans, the brain is normal sized. So unless you're able to get PET scans or all this functional MRI, you can see some loss of function. So does it mean brain can atrophy due to disuse, just like muscles can? Or just like your input on this? Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you for your work, Baba Wale, and thank you for your concern for individuals with dementia. As I mentioned earlier in the Hangout, my wife is in that field as a geriatrician, taking care of individuals with Alzheimer's disease and other kinds of dementia. So it's an area that's close to my professional world and certainly very close in my family. I think that there are a number of reasons why an individual could experience dementia. Certainly Alzheimer's disease is a leading cause of dementia, but there are other conditions that can give rise to dementia. So one would want to understand better what are those conditions. Some of them lead to rather dramatic atrophy of the cerebral cortex, such that that change could be demonstrable in a rather basic kind of CT scan or MR scan. Other changes require more advanced imaging technologies, such as PET scan for beta amyloid deposition in the brain. But I would also say that sometimes dementia is misdiagnosed, or at least difficult to diagnose, because there may be other conditions present. For example, delirium, particularly with individuals that are experiencing an acute medical crisis of some sort. Sometimes depression, particularly in older adults, can be very disorienting and can resemble dementia. So it would be important to differentiate those conditions that are treatable in relatively straightforward means that are available to us clinically from those conditions that are much more difficult to treat, such as Alzheimer's disease. Now, it certainly is the case that as we study Alzheimer's disease, we're discovering individuals who seem to be functioning rather well, yet at autopsy it's discovered that they had a tremendous burden of plaques and tangles, and sometimes even considerable cortical atrophy. And then there are some individuals who seem to be well progressed into dementia, and yet at autopsy their brains are within normal limits of atrophy and plaque and tangle burden. So there's a growing sense in which our classical pathophysiological markers for Alzheimer's disease are not really telling us the whole story and are not giving us a full picture of a person's functional capacity. So I'm not quite sure whether to take that as good news or bad news. Maybe that's just a call for further research and investigation. But I do think it's remarkable how resilient the brain is, and how there may still be methods that we can use to maximize a person's cognitive capacity, even in the context of degeneration. One example I'm thinking of is a renewed effort, at least here in this country, to use personalized music as a way of resurrecting the cognitive capacities of an individual that's slipping into dementia. And what I mean by personalized music is music that is meaningful to a person's own life story. If it were possible, for example, to take an older person and resurrect for them the soundtrack of their youth, whatever that meant, the songs that they grew up with, there may be a remarkable means by which the brain can engage with those memories and support a higher degree of cognition. There are some very nice published studies showing exactly this result. And there is more of now a widespread effort to use interventions such as music as a way to try to restore cognitive capacity that otherwise seems to be slipping away in the context of dementia. So those are just some thoughts that I would have. Again, I apologize for a rather lengthy response, but feel free to follow up, Baba Wale, if you have an additional comment or question. You are currently muted, though, so you would.
All right, it's unmuted now.
There you go.
Yes, so I appreciate your comments, and especially the last part about the music. Even though we do something like that over here, but a bit differently, we tend to advise patients with dementia to be taken to where they grew up, So maybe most times they are from the rural areas, from the village, and they've come to the cities to stay with their children. So we try to discourage this, get them to where they were when they were growing up. So they tend to do better there than when they are in a strange environment. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I'm going to mention that to my wife and see what she thinks about it. Maybe she can incorporate that in her practice.
All right, all right. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's go to Ulf, who joined us a few minutes ago. So, Ulf, please unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Hi, I'm not sure whether I activated my microphone.
You did. I can hear you very well.
Great. It's the first time I use this Google Hangout. First of all, congratulations for this highly interesting course. It's incredible how you managed to do it in such a lively manner. I'm enthusiastic about it.
Well, thank you.
Also, Ellen Foss has done a wonderful job also. So I'm an American. Well, I've grown up in Germany, and now I've been living in Spain for many years. I'm not from the field at all. I'm an engineer from studying, but I'm in sales, well, related with industry. And I like your previous words because I love classical music, and I was wondering whether to inscribe in this other course one of your colleagues is doing, Professor Purvis, I think, about biology and music. And I have a daughter who is a speech therapist. She had some neurology, and she's also very interested in music therapy, so that's very interesting. And how did I come to this course? Maybe, I think two reasons. One is I think it's good to train this muscle we have on the top of our shoulders, and the best thing is to do some interesting course. And of course, neuroscience is very challenging. And then I have been doing yoga for many years, and a year ago I made a course for yoga instructor, Hatha Yoga, and I got aware more and more about how is our mind working, and what do we think, and what is reality, and what is health. So I got very interested in the human body. I inscribed in the course of introductory physiology because I thought going to neuroscience directly is too difficult. And I just finished that course. It was very interesting too. And now I'm struggling to keep up with this huge amount of knowledge you try to transmit. And well, I'm a bit ashamed about my little knowledge about this field, and I admire many of the student colleagues who seem to be real experts already. But here, in a humble way, I am to learn, and it's so interesting, really.
Well, I appreciate that very much. It's always good to hear a bit of the stories of the people that are part of our community. I think we all have something to contribute, and we all have something to learn. So I appreciate your willingness to be part of that community, Ulf. Do you have a particular question related to the course that we could discuss?
Well, maybe a more general question coming to my mind now in these days of, I don't know whether it's a topic of this course. There's so much violence going on in the world right now, all over the planet. And one of your nice questions was, what is making us human? Of course, you were more thinking about the human species, but I also think what is going on in our minds and violence. I think everybody has some potential of violence in us, and if we have the right genes, if we are healthy, and if we are in a good environment, normally I think the violence should not come out very much. Of course, sometimes I myself, I am maybe violent in some response sometimes, but how is it possible that more and more people go out in order to kill each other and kill themselves? That's terrible. And maybe related to this course, in one of these threads, somebody spoke about the mirror neurons.
Right.
And a fear of myself is making publicity of violence hasn't it an effect of the mirror neurons in potential radical people in order to imitate?
Yeah.
So I don't know whether that's a question for your course. Sorry.
No, it's an excellent question, and really, neuroscience is about all questions at some level. The question of violence, though, particularly in social, public, and even political contexts, is an important one, and it's a question that's starting to be studied by neuroscientists such as Lazana Harris, who used to be a colleague of mine here at Duke, but moved about 2 years ago to University College London. And what Professor Harris is studying is what's going on in the brain that can be manipulated by, let's say, propaganda or rhetoric or other kinds of political speech that can motivate acts of violence. So he is studying these things, and he's basically finding two kinds of responses in the brain. One is that there are parts of the brain, including a region right around here, which is in the right hemisphere near the junction of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobe, that seems to be particularly engaged when we are embedded in pro-social networks. That is, when we're in relation with other human beings, and there's generally a positive direction to the nature of those relationships. Well, when people are experiencing highly prejudicial thoughts that might be one step down a path that leads to violence, it seems as though this part of the brain becomes much less active when we encounter those kinds of social relations, or at least there are some studies that are suggesting that. Meanwhile, here in the medial temporal lobe is the amygdala. And in the amygdala complex, we have neural circuits that are processing the potential of threat. So those structures seem to increase their activity as we're making these value judgments. So essentially what's going on here, and this is really still an ongoing matter of discussion and investigation, but the thoughts are that there's a process of dehumanization where the pro-social networks of the brain are diminished in their connectivity or their activity, and meanwhile those parts of the brain that are processing signals of threat, particularly from out-group members, that those areas of the brain are increasing in their activity and their motivation of behavior. So these two factors together, dehumanization with increased threat perception, seems to put a person's mind in that frame that is prone to acts of violence against other people. And I think the more we understand these mechanisms, potentially the more hope we have to try to understand how can we try to interrupt the sequence of events that leads to these kinds of catastrophic judgments when it comes to relating one human being to another.
I have a comment.
But you know,
Yeah, I
the
may.
world around us just suggests that we have so much more that we need to understand in every sense. Neuroscience, of course, just being one perspective on all of this.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Ulf. We're going to go next to someone who's joined us in just the last couple of minutes. Anal? I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Anal, are you with us?
Yes, sir. Anil. Good evening, sir.
Anal.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go right ahead.
Good evening, sir. So I have two questions involving evolution of brain.
Yes.
So why did brain evolve to forget some visual facts or visual scene? Why did the brain evolve to forget? What benefit did our ancestors have?
Well, I'm only going to speculate on that, but I think it really has to do with our capacity to process and store information, which is far limited relative to the experience of the moment. So when we consider all of the experiences of our mind and our body as we go throughout our day, that's a huge amount of information, and our capacity to process and store and consolidate that information is quite limited. And given that limitation, we have to be very selective about what information we process for our benefit. Now, often memory is not quite so strategic, and we remember things and we wonder, why did I remember that when something much more important I've forgotten? But I think your capacity to forget is probably a quite healthy function of the mind that is necessary in order to consolidate information and learn in a useful way. So I think the ability to forget is actually essential. There seems to be some pathology of forgetting in some individuals that have been described over the years, and many of these individuals seem to have mental illness as a consequence of their seemingly enhanced ability to process detail and remember. But with that said, I think there's a huge range within what we call the neurotypical population when it comes to processing information, attending to detail, and then somehow storing or internalizing that information. So,
Sir, but could not it have been? It would have been in our conscious control. Like, this thing I want to remember, I remember this thing. This thing I don't want to remember, I will not remember this thing.
well, I think there are various means by which we can try to ensure the security of our memory. I think a lot of that would relate to the associations we build. So, for example, if we were to create associations with space, with time, with various sensory modalities, then maybe the information we're taking in will be more effective in eliciting a memory that we are actually internalizing and processing and are able to recall. There are various techniques that people who work on memory have elaborated in order to do just that. I know when I'm teaching my own students here on campus, I always encourage them to learn as actively as possible, to often move their bodies while they learn, and to make visual their knowledge, and to do so with as much movement, with much dynamic action as possible. And that's one way of giving the brain more to work with and to build association that leads to memory.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, and my second question was that our brain only thinks in 3 dimensions. Like, we can visualize 3D objects. So, can our neural systems be modified so that we can think in 4 dimensions or 5 dimensions?
Well, I would be very interested to hear from maybe a theorist or a mathematician, someone who's skilled in the more abstract than I am, but I suspect that we can create higher dimensional cognitive maps than we normally would think about. So, you know, this idea of cognitive mapping, I think, is quite intriguing. It's, of course, quite simple to think about a 2-dimensional or a 3-dimensional space, but it need not be limited to those dimensions. Getting back to your first question about memory, one technique for memory that's been around for at least 2 millennia is this idea of building a memory castle. That is, to create a 3-dimensional space in your mind where you can store information. And one way to add the 4th dimension is movement. So if you move through that castle, that space in your mind, you're adding that 4th dimension that allows you to potentially store more information. Now, you may not be aware of exactly how that's playing out in your brain, but it seems to be a very useful tool. So I think for those theorists who are just more skilled in in thinking in abstract terms, or maybe an artist or someone, a poet, someone who just creates these very complex figures in their imagination. They may already acquire such skills, and maybe people like myself, who a bit more concrete in my style of thinking, can learn from.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for this
You're welcome. Thank you.
course.
And where are you, Anil?
So I'm from Bangalore, India.
Wonderful. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, sir.
I think Ahmed wanted to jump in with another question. Thank you for waiting and for being with us. Go ahead.
Actually, I'm very glad that I waited to this.
I'm sorry, you froze up there. I didn't catch your...
I would just three small points. Out the umami taste, the monosodium glutamate. I hear talking that I'm not sure about. Does it really affect the cerebral cortex or the neurotransmitters in the brain? The second point, when Steve jumped in discussing the researches, from my personal point of view, I really think that neurogeneration should, it's already emphasized on, but I really think that neurogeneration is important in treating patients with several disorders. The third point, which is violence. Myself, I'm a Muslim, yes, and I know some people just hearing the word Muslim will accuse me. I myself know some people who are sympathizers with ISIS. So I really don't think it's just about the some.
Ahmed, I'm sorry, but you've really broken up quite a bit, and I don't think we've caught all of your questions, but let me just try to quickly address those pieces that I heard. So the umami question,
Okay.
there do seem to be dedicated taste receptors that respond to glutamate and its various analogs, and those do seem to be connected via neural pathways that run through the relevant cranial nerves 7, 9, and 10, mostly cranial nerve 7, to the brainstem, to the nucleus that integrates those gustatory signals, the nucleus of the solitary tract. So I think that is a legitimate labeled line for taste. Your other comments, particularly the last comment about violence, I'm sorry, I didn't hear most of your comment because the connection was breaking up. But you were talking about having other perspectives and other factors that one should consider, and I'm sure we all would agree with that. I think the question of human violence is an extremely deep and troubling question, and multiple perspectives are necessary. I think we need the perspective of faith communities. We need the perspective of the wisdom of our cultures, as rich and diverse as they are. We also need the tools and the methods of social science, of natural science, including neuroscience. But we also need our political systems to engage and interact in productive and helpful ways. And we know that each of those components can so easily break down, and quite sadly they often do in various places. Well, we are just about out of our allotted time, and so we did have one person just jump in, and I'd like to maybe give Sasha the last word. Sasha, are you there? Well, Sasha may have joined us, but maybe she's not fully enabled to jump in the Hangout. Well, I think I should just wrap things up then. So thank you all so much for joining us. And for those of you that were watching this or might watch this on our YouTube channel, thanks for your attention as well. And we will definitely do this again, okay? So we'll we'll try to have hangouts like this from time to time. Meanwhile, I would just encourage you to jump into our discussion forum and raise questions that you may have there for the community. So again, thank you all for your participation. I'm sorry we can't.
Can I ask a question before we leave?
Okay, I'll give you, since Sasha's not able to join us, I'll give you one more chance, Praneet.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So basically, do you know of any like CIA like experiments on how to enhance the mind to make people like have the ability to like hypnotize or like remote, like conscious and connect to like the mind and stuff remotely?
I know nothing about the CIA, and I have no relationship at all to the federal government and the science that they may be pursuing. But with that said, I do know of neuroscience studies involving animal models in particular that are doing very much those kinds of things, trying to manipulate the behavior through modulating brain activity. And what can be done in an animal model at some point is likely to be translatable to humans. I personally have a lot of ethical and moral objection to some of the work that is possible, so I would not welcome it as a translatable science to humans. But the general notion of altering the structure and function of the brain in order to manipulate behavior is within the domain of modern neuroscience now, and there are animal studies that are doing just that. Okay, I think Sasha has joined us, so I will really go to Sasha and let her have the last question or the last comment. So Sasha, if you could unmute yourself, go right ahead. Well, I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. I think you're muted again. Now you're unmuted. But we don't seem to have a very good connection to you, Sasha.
Can you type your question in? You should be able to type your question in that little comment chat box.
Nick, do you want to say that again?
If you look up, there's a chat box on the you're looking at the screen, the top left. It's a little blue chat box. You just want to type your question in there.
Well, I'm sorry, Sasha. It doesn't look like this is going to work right now. But hopefully, at some point in the future, you can either post your question to the discussion forum or look for our next Hangout, and we'll try to do this again. We'll try to get some more people involved. So again, thank you all for your participation, and thank you all for your interest in neuroscience and the passion you're bringing to this course and all that you're doing to help contribute to our global learning community. We deeply appreciate that. So I hope to see you in the future, but for now I think we'll conclude our Hangout at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.